The lantern had burned so low it was barely more than a dying amber ember when Marshal Lewis Wells pushed open the door to the jailhouse and found her. Stella Grady was slumped over the front desk, her dark hair spilling across the wood in a wave of exhaustion, her cheek pressed against the open pages of the watch log, one hand still loosely curled around a pencil, as though her body had simply surrendered mid-sentence. The rifle she had been minding leaned against the desk at a precarious angle, and the tin coffee cup beside her had gone stone cold. Outside, the wind was doing something violent to the shutters, and somewhere down Creed Street, a dog was barking at shadows. Lewis stood in the doorway for a long moment. His jaw tightened in that particular way it always did when something moved him, and he refused to let it show. He had ridden hard from the Delaney homestead, 12 miles through a moonless stretch of flatland with the smell of coming rain in his nose, and he had fully expected to find Deputy Cal Rudd sitting at that desk, armed and alert, because that was the arrangement. That was what Lewis had ordered before he left. Rudd was supposed to hold the watch until dawn, but Rudd was not there. Stella Grady was, and she had been doing it alone. Lewis realized with a cold jolt in his chest, for God only knew how long. The watch log showed entries in her handwriting going back to 10 o'clock, and the clock on the wall now read 2:30 in the morning. The prisoner in the back cell, a horse thief named Dale Cutter who had friends in low places and a talent for making trouble, was snoring. At least that was something. Lewis crossed the room quietly. He set his saddlebags down on the bench by the wall without a sound. He looked at her for a second too long, at the dark circles under her closed eyes, at the way her shoulders curved inward with the kind of weariness that does not come from a single sleepless night, but from carrying something heavy for a very long time. Then he reached forward and carefully, without touching her, slid the rifle away from its dangerous lean and propped it properly against the wall. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, and then he reached out and laid one broad hand gently on her shoulder. "Stella," he said. His voice came out lower than he intended, rougher around the edges, the way it always did when he was not performing the marshal and was just being himself. "Stella, come on. I will take the watch from here." She stirred. Her eyes opened slowly, glazed first with the confusion of being yanked from deep sleep, and then they sharpened with something that looked almost like shame. "I was not sleeping," she said immediately. "You were sleeping," he said. "I was resting my eyes. For 4.5 hours by the look of that log." She sat up straight, pushing her hair back from her face, and the pencil rolled off the desk and clattered to the floor. She stared at him with those dark eyes of hers, and Lewis had learned by now that there was a particular quality to the way Stella Grady looked at a person when she had been caught doing something vulnerable. It was not softness. It was the precise opposite of softness. It was a kind of fierce, bristling dignity that dared you to say one word about it. He did not say one word about it. "Where is Rudd?" she asked. "That is an excellent question," Lewis said, leaning back in his chair and folding his arms across his chest. The rain was starting now, tapping at the roof in an exploratory way as though it had not yet committed to the endeavor. "One I intend to have a conversation with him about tomorrow morning." "He left at 9, Stella said. "Said he had a family matter. I told him I would cover until you returned." Lewis looked at her for a moment. There were approximately 12 things he wanted to say, and none of them were appropriate given the hour, given the circumstances, given the 4-month history of whatever this was between them that neither of them had named or acknowledged or done anything whatsoever to resolve. "You should not have had to do that," he said finally. "Someone had to," she replied. And that right there was the entire compressed history of Stella Grady in one sentence. Someone had to. So she did. He had come to understand that about her, the hard way, over many weeks of watching her and arguing with her and being quietly, stubbornly, thoroughly undone by her. But to explain how Lewis Wells had arrived at the particular anguish of standing in a dim jailhouse at 2 in the morning, looking at a woman he could not have and could not stop thinking about, one would need to go back to the beginning. Back to that burning afternoon in early June when a wagon had rolled into Cutter's Creek from the east, and Stella Grady had stepped down from it with a carpetbag in one hand and a rifle in the other, and the whole story had begun. Cutter's Creek, Texas, in the year 1882, was not a town that inspired confidence on first impression. It sat in a shallow bowl of red-brown earth, surrounded by scrub oak and cedar, with a main street wide enough to turn a wagon team and dusty enough to coat a man's teeth with grit by mid-afternoon. There was a general store, a livery, a saloon called the Iron Horse, a church that doubled as a schoolroom, a doctor's office above the feed store, and the jailhouse at the far end, which also served as the marshal's office and technically Lewis Wells's residence, since he slept in the small room behind the cells. It was a town that had seen better years and worse ones, and in the summer of 1882 it was sitting in one of the worse ones, because a man named Victor Crane had decided to make it the center of his operations. Victor Crane ran a protection scheme across 4 counties. He had 6 men who rode for him, and they had names that had become something like ghost stories in the smaller settlements. He had been burning out homesteaders who would not pay, and the ones who complained to the law had a habit of going quiet afterward. Lewis Wells had been brought in from Abilene 8 months prior, specifically because the previous marshal had gone quiet in that particular way, and Lewis had spent those 8 months building a case against Crane that was real, documented, and he hoped bulletproof. It was not, as it turned out, entirely bulletproof. But that came later. The day Stella Grady arrived, Lewis had been standing outside the jailhouse sorting through a stack of wanted notices when the eastbound wagon rolled in. He had barely glanced at it. Wagons came and went. Cutter's Creek was small, but it sat on the road between 2 larger towns, and travelers passed through regularly. What made him look twice was the argument. The wagon driver, a heavy-set man named Cord Purdy who ran a freight service out of San Angelo, was trying to explain to the woman who had just climbed down from the wagon that he was not responsible for the fact that the hotel had closed down, and the woman was explaining to him, in a voice that was entirely controlled but had a very particular edge to it, that she had paid him to deliver her to a working establishment, and not to a ghost. The Cutter's Creek Hotel had indeed shut down 3 weeks prior when its owner, a man named Hatch, had gotten wind of Crane's men asking after him and had relocated himself to somewhere safer. Lewis knew this. The whole town knew this. It had been unfortunate. The woman did not know this. She was not particularly tall, but she had a kind of contained energy that made her seem to take up more space than her dimensions suggested. She had dark hair pinned up under a traveling hat, a narrow face with strong features, and brown eyes that were currently occupied with directing a very precise form of displeasure at Cord Purdy. She was wearing a traveling dress that had seen considerable dust, and the carpetbag she had set at her feet was large and well used, and the rifle she was carrying was a Winchester model 1873, and it was very clearly not decorative. Lewis had folded the wanted notices and walked over. "Is there a difficulty?" he asked, directing the question primarily at Cord Purdy, who looked relieved at the interruption. "Hotel's closed," Purdy said. "She ain't happy about it." "I am not unhappy about it," Stella Grady said, turning those brown eyes on Lewis with the distinct impression that she was taking his measure and not yet certain he passed. "I am simply asking where I am supposed to stay, since the advertisement I responded to specifically mentioned the Cutter's Creek Hotel as an available accommodation." "What advertisement?" Lewis asked. She reached into the small bag hung from her wrist and produced a folded newspaper clipping. Lewis took it. It was from the San Angelo paper, 2 months old, and it was an advertisement placed by Mayor Elias Boone seeking a schoolteacher for Cutter's Creek. The advertisement did indeed mention the hotel as available for housing and had been printed before anyone knew Hatch would be leaving. "I am Stella Grady," she said. "I have correspondence from Mayor Boone confirming my position. I start on Monday." Lewis looked at the clipping. He looked at her. He looked at the rifle. "Teachers usually do not carry Winchesters," he observed. Teachers usually do not travel alone through ranch country with a cash payment for their first month's housing, she replied. I do both, and the Winchester is why I am still in a position to do either. Lewis had handed the clipping back to her. There was something happening in his chest that he did not examine too carefully. There is a boarding house on the corner of Creed and 2nd, he said. Mrs. Ida Pratt runs it. She has rooms. It is clean and she does not ask unreasonable questions. Stella Grady had looked at him for a moment, and something in her expression shifted very slightly, like a card being turned face down rather than face up. Thank you, she said. And you are? Lewis Wells, Marshal. She had nodded once, picked up her carpet bag, and walked in the direction he had pointed without another word. He had watched her go and then had gone back to his wanted notices, and told himself he was not going to think about her again, which was the first outright lie he had told himself in a long time. Mrs. Ida Pratt was a widow in her 60s with strong opinions about propriety, excellent biscuits, and a complete inability to mind her own business, all three of which were useful in different ways. She had taken Stella in without much fanfare, and had begun her informal investigation into the new schoolteacher's background within approximately 48 hours. Which was how Lewis had come to know, by the end of the first week, that Stella Grady was 26 years old, that she had come from a place called Harlan County in eastern Kentucky, that she had been teaching school for 3 years, that she had no husband and had declined several offers of same, and that she had left Kentucky for reasons she had not specified to Mrs. Pratt, which Mrs. Pratt found both suspicious and intriguing. Lewis had filed this information away and told himself it was simply useful background on a new resident. He had his first actual conversation with Stella on her 4th day in Cutter's Creek, when she walked into his office and asked him directly about Victor Crane. He had been making coffee on the small iron stove in the corner of the jailhouse when she appeared in the doorway, and his first thought, which he immediately dismissed, was that she looked entirely too composed for a woman who had supposedly come out here simply to teach school. Marshal Wells, she said, I want to know about Victor Crane. Lewis had set the coffee pot down with deliberate calm. Where did you hear that name? He asked. 3 separate people mentioned it to me today, she said. 2 in a whisper and 1 with a look over their shoulder. That kind of name-dropping usually means something specific in a town this size. It means there is a threat that everyone knows about and nobody is talking about directly. Lewis had studied her for a moment. What makes it your business, Miss Grady? I have children in my classroom whose families are being threatened, she said, and there was no performance in it, no dramatics. It was simply a statement of fact delivered with the flatness of something she had already decided. That makes it my business. I am not asking to get involved. I am asking so that I understand what I am walking into and can make informed decisions about it. He had told her what he could tell her, which was not the whole story, but was enough. Crane ran protection, had muscle, had made people disappear. Lewis was building a legal case. The U.S. Marshal's office in Austin was involved. It was a matter of time. Stella had listened without interrupting, which was the first time he had felt listened to in a while. All right, she had said when he finished. Thank you. I would prefer you not repeat any of that, Lewis said. I understand discretion, Marshal, she said, and there was just the faintest edge in it, the kind that says I have had to. She had left, and Lewis had stood in his office with his cold coffee and acknowledged to himself, with considerable reluctance, that Stella Grady was going to be a complication. The first month passed in a rhythm of near misses and carefully maintained distance. Lewis saw her regularly because Cutter's Creek was not large enough to avoid anyone, and he found, in those brief intersections at the general store or in the street or on the steps of the church on Sundays, that each time he braced himself against her, and each time she somehow found a way past the bracing without appearing to try. She did not flirt. She did not make any overt attempts to reduce the professional distance between them. She was simply, consistently, entirely herself, and herself was apparently something Lewis Wells was not equipped to be indifferent to. She had a way of saying exactly what she meant that was so rare in his experience that it felt almost aggressive at first. She had opinions that she stated clearly and defended thoughtfully, and adjusted when presented with better information, which was something Lewis could count on one hand the number of times he had witnessed in grown adults. She was funny in a dry, quiet way that mostly emerged in asides rather than pronouncements, so that half the time you were not sure she had meant it to be funny, and then you thought about it again and realized she absolutely had. He was in serious trouble by the end of July. He knew it and he did not do anything about it, because there were about 5 reasons why nothing could or should happen, and he went over those reasons regularly like a man checking a fence line. The first reason was his job. He was in the middle of a dangerous, active investigation. Getting emotionally entangled with anyone was a liability. The second reason was his past. Lewis Wells was 32 years old, and he had spent those years largely in the company of violence, first as a soldier in his early 20s in the last gasping conflicts along the southern border, then as a lawman in 3 different territories. He had seen what that life did to the people who were close to the men who lived it. He had no interest in doing that to someone he cared about. The third reason was that Stella Grady had come here for a specific purpose that had nothing to do with him, and she deserved to pursue that purpose without a complication that she had not asked for. The fourth reason was that he was not entirely sure she liked him, in the personal sense. She clearly found him useful and possibly tolerable, but there was a careful maintenance of exactly the appropriate social distance in her behavior toward him that he chose to read as preference. The fifth reason was that something had happened to her before she came to Cutter's Creek, something that had left a mark, and whatever it was, she was not ready to have it close to anyone, and Lewis understood marks because he had several of his own. He was in the middle of conducting this internal argument with himself one evening in late July when Deputy Cal Rudd, who was a decent enough lawman but not notably perceptive, said to him across a game of cards, "You going to keep pretending you are not making eyes at the schoolteacher, or you going to do something about it?" "I am not making eyes," Lewis said. "You watched her walk across the street for about 45 seconds this morning," Rudd said. "I counted." Lewis had put down his cards and gone to bed. August brought 2 things: the beginning of the real trouble with Crane, and the moment Lewis understood what had happened to Stella Grady. He found out about the Crane situation first. One of his sources, a man named Ben Archer who ran a small ranch south of town and kept his eyes open, rode in on a Wednesday morning and told Lewis that Crane had learned about the investigation. Not the details, but enough. Enough to be dangerous. Enough to make Lewis move his documented evidence to a location outside the jailhouse. Enough to put him on a very short timeline. He found out about Stella the same week, and he found out by accident, which was how he found out most things that mattered. He had been walking back from the livery stable late on a Thursday evening when he passed the window of Mrs. Pratt's boarding house. The curtains were not quite drawn, and the lamp inside was burning, and Stella was sitting at the small desk in what appeared to be the parlor, writing a letter. But what stopped him was not the writing. It was the man who had appeared at the front door while Lewis stood in the dark of the street, a man Lewis had never seen before, a broad, florid-faced man in a decent suit, and even from the street Lewis could hear the particular quality of his voice through the thin wall, which was the quality of a man who was accustomed to being obeyed. He heard Stella's voice respond, quieter but no less certain. Then Mrs. Pratt's voice, firmly. Then the man's voice again, with a particular word in it that made Lewis's hands close. He had been about to go to the door when Stella appeared in the window, looked directly out into the street and saw him standing there. Their eyes met through the glass. She shook her head once very slightly and the message was unmistakably clear. "Do not come in. I have this." Lewis had stayed where he was, coiled with the tension of not moving. The man left 10 minutes later, walking fast and angry toward the livery, and Lewis had stayed in the shadow of the street until he was gone and then waited another 20 minutes to give Stella time to settle. And then he had knocked on Mrs. Pratt's door. Stella had come to the parlor door with a composure that he suspected cost her something and said, "I imagine you have questions. Only if you want to answer them," he said. Mrs. Pratt had disappeared toward the kitchen with the dignity of someone who very much wanted to stay and listen but had been raised too well for it. Stella had sat down, and after a pause that Lewis did not rush, she had told him. The man's name was Gerald Ashworth. He was the son of the most prominent man in Harlan County. He had decided 2 years ago that Stella would make him a suitable wife. She had declined. He had not considered declining to be a final answer. He had made things progressively more difficult for her. He had pressured her employer. He had spread a carefully constructed version of her history that made her sound unsuitable. He had appeared at her residence twice, and eventually he had made it clear that either she would accept or she would find her options in Harlan County reduced to nothing. She had left. She had found the advertisement. She had come here. And now he had apparently hired someone to track her, because Gerald Ashworth was the kind of man who could not tolerate the existence of something he wanted and could not have. "He has followed you here," Lewis said. It was not a question. "Apparently," she said. "Did he threaten you tonight?" She paused, and the pause was its own answer. "He made statements that could reasonably be interpreted as threats." Lewis looked at her for a long moment. "I can handle this, Stella." It was the first time he had used her first name. He had not planned it. It simply came out, and there was a very quiet but unmistakable shift in the air between them. "I know," she said, and her voice had changed slightly too. Something had softened in it by about a single degree, which on Stella Grady's scale of emotional expression was considerable. "But I would rather handle it myself if I can. And if you cannot, then I will tell you," she said. He had accepted that, because it was what she was offering, and because pushing past what she was offering would have been a different kind of damage. What Lewis had not told Stella that night was that Gerald Ashworth's arrival in Cutter's Creek was a serious additional complication, because Lewis was already managing one dangerous situation, and adding a second one in the form of a wealthy man with grievances and possible connections was not something he wanted. He had Rudd make quiet inquiries the next morning about where Ashworth was staying, and learned that Ashworth had taken a room at the Iron Horse, which meant he was planning to be here for more than a day. Lewis had gone to speak with Ashworth himself, which was not precisely within the legal boundaries of his jurisdiction, since no specific crime had yet been committed, but which was entirely within the boundaries of the kind of clear communication that Lewis excelled at. The conversation had been brief. Lewis had explained, in the particular measured way he had of explaining things that left very little room for alternate interpretation, that Stella Grady was a resident of Cutter's Creek under his protection, that she had expressed no desire for Ashworth's presence, and that the marshal's office took a serious view of harassment. Ashworth had made the mistake of trying to explain that this was a private domestic matter, and Lewis had made clear, with one quiet sentence, that there was no such thing as a private domestic matter when it landed in his town. Ashworth had left 2 days later. Stella had found out about the conversation, naturally, because Mrs. Pratt knew everything that happened in Cutter's Creek within approximately 8 hours of it happening. She had come to the jailhouse and stood in his doorway with an expression he had not seen on her face before. "You spoke to him," she said. "I did. I told you I wanted to handle it myself." "You did," Lewis agreed. "And I respected that for 2 days, and when it became clear that he was not going to leave on his own, I spoke to him, because it was within my job to do so." She had stared at him for a long moment, and Lewis could see her working through something, deciding something. "Was it only your job?" she asked. The question hung between them like smoke. "No," Lewis said, and he did not look away from her when he said it. Another long pause. Then, so quietly he had to read it more than hear it, she said, "Thank you, Lewis." And she had left, and Lewis had sat down in his chair and put his face in his hands for approximately 30 seconds and then gotten up and gone back to work. September arrived like a slow-burning fuse. The case against Crane was nearly complete. Lewis had enough documented evidence of extortion, coercion, and accessory to the deaths of 2 homesteaders to send Crane and at least 3 of his men to prison, possibly to hang. He was waiting for a response from the U.S. Marshal's office in Austin, to whom he had sent the full dossier with the request for formal backup before he moved to arrest. The response was supposed to arrive by September 15th. On September 10th, one of Crane's men tried to burn down the jailhouse. It happened at 2 in the morning. Lewis was asleep in the back room when the smell woke him, that acrid, specific smell of wood that is catching rather than burning, the smell of something that has just been started. He was up and moving before he was fully conscious, pulling on his boots and his gun belt, and he got to the front of the jailhouse in time to see the outside wall beginning to blacken at the base, where someone had piled rags soaked in coal oil. He put it out himself with the water barrel, working fast in the dark with the single-minded efficiency of someone who has dealt with emergencies and knows that panic is a luxury. Then he went into the street and found the man Crane had sent, who had not quite made it back to his horse fast enough, and Lewis arrested him, which was how he ended up with Dale Cutter in the back cell, because Dale Cutter was that man, and it turned out he had a history of horse theft as well as arson for hire, all of which was very useful information. But the real consequence of the failed fire was that Crane now knew Lewis had enough to move against him, and Lewis was out of time. He sent a second message to Austin the next morning and told Stella, carefully and without the specific details, that things were going to move in the next week or 2 and that she should be alert and let him know immediately if she saw anything unusual. She had looked at him steadily when he said this woman who had been quietly navigating a town full of secrets for 3 months, and said, "What kind of unusual? Strangers. Movement on the road south of town. Anyone asking questions about me or the jailhouse?" "All right," she said. "And Stella," he said, and he paused because he was not good at this, was not good at saying things he meant and having them land as gently as he intended. "Be careful." She had looked at him with those dark eyes that had been making his internal arguments more and more difficult, and she had said, quietly, "You too." The 2 weeks that followed were the tightest, most compressed period of Lewis Wells's professional life. He rode out twice to meetings with Ben Archer and others who were feeding him information on Crane's movements. He coordinated with a deputy marshal named Holt who had ridden in quietly from Austin in plainclothes in response to his second message, and they mapped out an arrest plan. He kept his evidence in a locked strongbox buried beneath the floorboards of Mrs. Pratt's cellar, which Mrs. Pratt had agreed to with the calm of a woman who had lived in frontier country long enough to know when something important was happening. And in among all of this, he kept running into Stella. Not literally, or not always literally, though there had been one actual collision outside the general store that had ended with his steadying hand on her arm, and both of them standing very still for approximately 2 seconds longer than physics required. What he kept running into was the fact of her, the way she had quietly become a piece of the town that he thought about constantly. The way the children in her classroom had started smiling more, which he noticed because the children moved through his days like small markers of the town's health. The way she had started leaving coffee for him on the front step of the jailhouse on mornings when she passed early, just a small tin pot in the early light with no note and no explanation. He had never left a thank you note either, but he had started leaving a small wrapped piece of hard candy on the step of Mrs. Pratt's boarding house on those same mornings, tucked against the post where she would see it, because he had noticed once that she had a weakness for peppermint, and it was the only language he had available. Mrs. Pratt had at some point noticed both the coffee and the candy, and had apparently found the entire situation so romantically hopeless that she had taken to sighing whenever both their names came up in the same sentence. On the 22nd of September, a Friday, everything moved at once. The backup from Austin arrived at 7 in the morning. 3 deputy marshals and a federal warrant, which was everything Lewis had been waiting for. The arrest of Victor Crane was set for Sunday morning. 2 days. At 9 o'clock that same morning, one of Stella's students, a 9-year-old boy named Thomas Reese, whose family had been one of Crane's targets, did not come to school. Stella sent word to Lewis. Lewis sent Rudd to the Reese homestead. Rudd came back looking pale and said that the family was fine, but had been visited the night before by 2 of Crane's men who had told them that the marshal was about to get himself killed, and that anyone who had cooperated with his investigation should think carefully about their position. It was a message meant to cause panic and scatter his witnesses. Lewis had expected something like this. What he had not expected was that Crane would simultaneously send a man to tail Stella. He found out about the tale at noon when Stella walked into his office with the precise demeanor of a woman who is not going to show that she is frightened. "There is a man in a brown coat who has been following me since this morning," she said, standing in front of his desk. "He has been at a consistent distance of about half a block. He was outside the school when I left. He followed me here." Lewis was already standing. "Did he speak to you?" "No." "He is across the street right now, in front of the feed store." Lewis had gone to the window without moving the curtain and confirmed it. The man was one of Crane's, a rider named Bates who Lewis recognized. He was not making any particular effort to be subtle, which was itself the message. He was not a tale meant to gather information. He was a warning. See how easily we could reach her. Lewis had felt something go absolutely cold and absolutely clear inside him. The way a creek in winter goes clear when the cold strips everything out of it. And in that moment, the professional rationale for keeping his distance from Stella Grady had become entirely insufficient against the single, simple reality that she was being used as leverage against him, and he was not going to permit it. He had turned from the window and looked at her, and she had met his gaze with a controlled steadiness that he recognized because it was very close to his own. "You are staying here today," he said. "I have classes. Rudd will send word that school is canceled for the day. You are staying here." She had looked at him for a moment, and then, perhaps because she understood that this was not about his authority over her but about something genuinely dangerous, she had simply said, "All right." Lewis had dealt with Bates by the direct method of walking across the street and arresting him on the outstanding warrant he happened to have from 3 counties over, which was the useful thing about keeping thorough records. Bates was now in the 2nd cell next to Dale Cutter, and they were not happy about it, but that was their problem. The day had been long. Stella had sat in his office, working on lesson plans, and occasionally making observations about his filing system that were accurate but not entirely welcome. Lewis had moved between his desk and the door in a pattern that was partly tactical and partly the result of being unable to sit still within 10 feet of her for extended periods. At one point in the afternoon, she had looked up from her papers and said, out of nowhere, "Why did you come to Cutter's Creek? Really? You came from Abilene, but why this town?" Lewis had considered not answering and then had answered. The previous marshal was a good man. He was persuaded to stop being a marshal by people who should not have that kind of power. "That kind of thing bothers me." "You came for a dead man's justice," she said. It was not a criticism. "I came because someone should," he said. "And because I was tired of being sent to places where the work was already done and there was nothing left but paperwork." "You like the hard cases," she said. "I like the necessary ones," he said. "There is a difference." She had looked at him with something that was not quite a smile but contained all the structural elements of one. "What about you?" he said, because if she was going to take him apart with questions, it seemed fair. "Kentucky to Texas is a considerable distance. You could have gone to any number of places. I needed to go far enough that coming back would be a decision rather than a habit," she said. "There is something about distance that forces honesty. You cannot drift back to something that is a week's hard travel away. You have to actually want it." "And did you want it?" he asked. "Kentucky." She was quiet for a moment. "I wanted what I thought it was going to be," she said. not what it turned out to be. There is a difference." He had nodded slowly, because he knew precisely what she meant, and she had seemed to understand that he knew, and something had settled between them in that moment. Some mutual acknowledgement of the particular loneliness of being a person who had chosen their life deliberately, and still sometimes felt the weight of what that choosing had cost. He had not said anything else about it, and neither had she, but the room had felt different after that, closer in some way that had nothing to do with the space between them. That evening had been the first time he had asked her to consider staying somewhere other than Mrs. Pratt's for the duration, given the situation. Rudd had gone home. They were alone in the jailhouse, and the prisoners were quiet, and the sun was going down in its characteristic Texas way, all amber and indifference. "You could stay at Mrs. Pratt's and simply not move around," he said. "That would be safer. Or I could stay here," she said, "where you are." The way she said it was entirely practical, no inflection, nothing that announced itself as more than a logical assessment, but Lewis had heard it and had gone entirely still. "That would not be appropriate," he said carefully. "If it is between appropriate and safe," she said, in that same practical tone that was somehow the most dangerous thing about her, "I choose safe." He had let her stay. He had set her up with blankets on the bench along the wall, and she had declined the blankets and sat instead at the front desk with the watch log and the rifle. And he had sat across from her, and they had talked for a while. Nothing revelatory, nothing that could be pointed to as a crossing of any particular line, just the kind of talking that happens when two people have stopped pretending to themselves. She had asked him about his time in the army, and he had given her an honest answer, which he almost never did. He had told her about the particular dehumanization of that period, the way violence had been normalized and then repackaged as duty, the way it had taken him years afterward to disentangle the two. She had listened without flinching, which he had expected, and without immediately offering an interpretation, which he had not. He had asked her about teaching, and she had told him about it in a way that made him understand why she had chosen it. Not the romantic version about shaping young minds, but the actual version, which was that she was good at it, and that doing a thing you are genuinely good at is one of the most reliable forms of meaning available to a person. She had also, somewhere in the middle of all this, made him laugh twice, actually laugh, which was not something he was known for. Around midnight, he had gone to the back room to check on the prisoners and returned to find her asleep at the desk. Just exactly that, her cheek on the open log, one hand around the pencil, as still as something painted. He had stood in the doorway of the back room and looked at her for a long moment, and felt something open up in him that he could not immediately identify and then could, which was the problem. He had gone back to the front room and pulled the chair across from her, and had sat with his back to the wall and his eyes on the door and kept watch until dawn, because she was asleep and there were prisoners in the back, and the town was nervous, and those were all the reasons he needed. In the morning she had woken and found him there, and looked at him with an expression that he filed carefully in the back of his memory, and planned never to look at it directly. Now it was the night before the Crane arrest, late September, and he had ridden to the Delaney homestead to ensure that Peter Delaney, one of his key witnesses, was secured and prepared for the following morning. He had left Rudd on watch, and he had come back to find Stella at the desk instead. "Come on," he said again in the dim light of the jailhouse with the rain now fully committed overhead. "I will take the watch from here. You should sleep properly." "I am fine," she said, but she said it with the tired honesty of someone who is not fine. "Stella." Something in his voice when he said her name must have been different this time, because she looked up at him with an expression he had not seen her direct at anyone, an expression that was not guarded, not measured, not the careful, controlled version of whatever she was actually feeling. "Lewis," she said quietly, "what happens tomorrow?" "Tomorrow we arrest Crane," he said, "and everything after that becomes ordinary." "You have no idea if that is true," she said. "No," he admitted, "but it is the direction we are moving." She looked at him for another long moment. Outside, the rain was doing its proper thing now, steady and serious, and the whole world was reduced to this single pool of dying lamplight. The prisoners slept. The clock ticked. Everything was very still. "Go lie down," he said, and he nodded toward the door that led to the small back room that was technically his quarters with its cot and its single blanket. "I mean the room back there. I will be here." "It is your room," she said. "You are using it," he said. "Go on." She stood. She was close enough that he could see the exhaustion in her face and something else beneath it that he was not going to name right now. Not tonight, not before the most dangerous day of the past 8 months. But she reached out, almost as if she were not entirely in control of the motion, and her hand rested for a moment on his arm, on the forearm just above his wrist, not gripping, just resting, and she said, "Be here when I wake up." He covered her hand with his for 1 second, one single second. "I will be here," he said. She went to the back room, and Lewis settled in at the front desk with the watch log and the rifle, and did not allow himself to feel anything at all until she was behind the closed door. And then he sat in the rain sound and the lamplight and felt approximately everything. And then he got himself back together and settled in for the longest night of his life. The arrest of Victor Crane happened at dawn on Sunday, September 24th, 1882. Lewis, Deputy Marshal Holt, and 2 additional federal deputies rode to Crane's main house on the southwest edge of the county, while Rudd and the other federal men covered the 2 positions in town where Crane's men were known to sleep. It was not clean, because nothing of this kind ever was. 2 of Crane's riders tried to run and were caught. One tried something more aggressive, and the situation resolved itself quickly, and without the loss of anyone Lewis was responsible for. Victor Crane himself, when confronted with the full weight of a federal warrant and the sum of 8 months of documented evidence, had nothing left to do but surrender, and he did it with the particular gray exhaustion of a man who has known for some time that this was coming. By 10 in the morning, Victor Crane was in the back cell of the Cutter's Creek jailhouse, and Dale Cutter had been transported to the county seat, and the 2 of Crane's men who had been in the town cells were being escorted by the federal deputies toward Austin. Lewis walked back into his jailhouse at 10:30 and found Stella standing at the front window looking out at the street, and she turned when he came in, and her face when she saw him alive and whole was the most unguarded thing he had ever seen on another person. He did not say anything. She did not say anything. She crossed the room and he met her halfway, and she put her hands against his chest, and he folded his arms around her, and they stood there in the middle of the jailhouse with the morning sun coming in long slats through the window, and neither of them said a word for a considerable time. When she pulled back to look at him, he looked at her, and there was nothing left between them that was ambiguous. "I have been trying very hard," Lewis said, "not to do anything you did not want." "I know," she said. "Have I been trying too hard?" he asked. The faintest, most genuine version of her smile appeared. "Lewis," she said, "yes." He laughed, actually laughed, the second time she had done that to him. Then he tucked a strand of hair behind her ear with a careful hand, and she leaned very slightly into the gesture, and he thought that nothing in the last 8 months had prepared him for how completely that small motion undid him. "I would like," he said carefully, "to do this properly, whatever this is." "It is a courtship," she said, with the dry precision that he had come to understand was her version of tenderness. "If you are asking." "I am asking," he said. "Then yes," she said, "I am agreeable to that." He shook his head at her, the way a person shakes their head at something both exasperating and wonderful. The weeks after Crane's arrest had the quality of a held breath slowly releasing. The town adjusted. The families who had been paying protection money stopped paying, and a few of them repaired their homesteads, and the atmosphere in Cutter's Creek gradually lost the particular tension that had been in it for so long that most people had stopped noticing it was there until it was gone. Crane was taken to Austin, tried before a federal judge, and convicted on multiple counts of extortion and conspiracy in the murders of 2 homesteaders. He was sentenced to 20 years and would not be back. Lewis filed his reports, completed his paperwork, and then, for the first time in 8 months, had a period of relative quiet. He used it to court Stella Grady in the way he had meant when he said properly, which was to say deliberately, attentively, and in a way that acknowledged both of their particular kinds of difficulty. He was not naturally expressive. This was something he accepted about himself, but he understood her well enough by now to know that she did not need flowery expressions. She needed consistency and presence and the kind of honesty that costs something to give. So he was consistent. He walked with her on Sunday mornings after church. He ate dinner at Mrs. Pratt's on Wednesday evenings when he was not on duty, something that made Mrs. Pratt so happy that she began setting an extra plate before he even knocked. He read the books she loaned him and talked about them with her in a way that surprised her. He could tell, because she had not expected him to be a reader, and he had not advertised it. He also talked to her about the things that were difficult to talk about the soldier years, about the 2 previous postings, where things had gone badly in ways that he carried, about why he did not let himself want things easily, because the history of his life was that wanting things created specific vulnerabilities that had been exploited in specific ways. She had told him more about Harlan County, about what it had been to have someone decide that she was a thing he was owed, about the particular corrosive effect it had had on her trust in her own perceptions, about how she had second-guessed herself for 2 years about whether she was reading situations correctly because someone had spent that long telling her that she was not. Lewis had listened to this with a very careful stillness, and then he had said, "You read situations exactly correctly. You have from the day you arrived here." She had looked at him for a moment with something bright in her eyes that she managed, just barely, not to shed. "You were the first person in a long time," she said, "who treated my assessment of a situation as information rather than an inconvenience." "Your assessments are always information," he said. "Most men do not feel that way," she said. "Most men are poorly organized," he said. She had laughed then, her real laugh, which she did not do often, and which was the best thing Lewis Wells had heard in a long time, and he thought that he would do a great deal to hear it regularly. October moved into November with its first cold fronts coming down from the north, and the cottonwood leaves going gold along the creek. Lewis asked Stella to dinner at the one restaurant Cutter's Creek had, a small establishment above the general store run by a Mexican family named Vega, and she wore a dress he had not seen before, a deep green dress that made him forget, momentarily, what he had meant to say at least 3 separate times during the evening. He had brought her home to Mrs. Pratt's boarding house after, and they had stood on the front step in the cold, clear night with the stars doing their extravagant Texas thing overhead, and Lewis had said, quietly and without decorating it, "I am in love with you. I have been for some time. I am not telling you because I expect anything from it tonight. I am telling you because you deserve to know what is true." She had been still for a moment, and then she had turned fully toward him and reached up and put both her hands on either side of his face, which he had not expected, and she had looked at him with those dark eyes that had been making him completely unreasonable for months, and she had said, "Lewis Wells, I am in love with you too. I have been fighting it since approximately the 2nd week of June because I was not ready to trust it. And now," he asked very quietly, "and now," she said, "I am ready." He had kissed her then, in the cold November night on the front step of Mrs. Pratt's boarding house with the stars overhead and the smell of cedar in the air. And it was nothing like the closed, controlled way he operated when he was being the marshal and everything like the person. He actually was underneath that, which was a man who had been keeping himself at a very careful distance from anything that mattered and had finally, under the sustained and particular influence of Stella Grady, decided that the distance was not worth the cost. Mrs. Pratt had been watching from the parlor window, which they both knew and neither acknowledged. November became December and December became the last month of 1882, and Lewis Wells spent most of it in the best sustained state of his adult life, which was a slightly bewildering experience for someone who had spent most of that adult life operating on controlled tension. He was still the marshal. He still had a job to do, but the job was quieter now, and the town was healing, and he had Stella. He had Stella, which was a phrase he thought sometimes at completely random moments, waiting for his coffee to heat or writing a report in the evening or listening to the December wind do its work on the eaves of the jailhouse. And it produced each time a warm, solid feeling that was nothing like the anxious, driving feeling of wanting and not having, and everything like the particular piece of something that is exactly where it belongs. He proposed to her in January. He had intended to do it at the Vega restaurant, with the green curtains and the good food, because that had been a good evening, and it seemed like a reasonable kind of symmetry. But what actually happened was that they were walking back from the creek on a Sunday afternoon, a walk they had taken to doing regularly on the days when the weather was tolerable, and she had been talking about something, about one of her students, Thomas Reese in fact, who had been struggling with arithmetic, and she had described the moment he had understood it, the specific light that had come into his face, and Lewis had looked at her while she talked about it with that complete, genuine investment that she brought to everything she cared about, and he had stopped walking. She had stopped too and looked at him. "What? Marry me," he said. Not a question, technically, or not the way he had planned it, but she had looked at him and understood that it was a question, a real one, and asking. "Marry you," she said. "Yes," he said. She was quiet for a moment, looking at him with that particular attention, and then she said, "Are you certain it is not a small thing, this life, your job?" "I know what this life is," he said. "I want it with you in it." "You understand that I will always say exactly what I think," she said. "I am counting on it," he said. "And that I will not be the kind of wife who stays home worrying," she said. "I know that," he said. "I am not asking for that kind of wife." "And that I have strong opinions about your filing system," she said. "Stella," he said. "Yes," she said. "Is that yes you will marry me, or yes you have strong opinions about my filing system?" "Both," she said. "Emphatically both." He shook his head at her for the second time in their history, and then pulled her close and kissed her forehead, and then her cheek, and then her mouth in the pale January sunlight. And she curved into him with the comfortable ease of someone who had decided where they belong and is done fighting it. They were married in March of 1883, in the Cutter's Creek church that doubled as a schoolroom, because it was Stella's territory in both its functions, and she had a sentimental streak. She would not admit to that made her want to be married in the place where she had built her life. The ceremony was performed by Pastor Elias Cole, and the whole of Cutter's Creek attended, which was perhaps 40 people, and Mrs. Pratt cried through the entire service and did not attempt to conceal it. Lewis Wells stood at the front of that small church in a clean dark suit, and watched Stella Grady walk toward him in a dress the color of winter cream, with her dark hair pinned up with small flowers that Mrs. Vega had made from silk, and he felt with absolute clarity that everything that had come before, the soldier years and the difficult postings and the long grinding years of choosing necessity over everything else, had been the road to this specific moment, and that the road had been worth it. She reached him and looked up at him and said, quietly, just between them before the ceremony began, "You are doing that thing where you look terrifying when you are actually feeling something." "I am not terrifying," he said. "You are slightly terrifying," she said. "It is one of your better qualities." He took her hand and the ceremony began. The spring after the wedding was the kind of spring that Texas occasionally produced to apologize for the summers, long and green and gentle, with the creek running full and the wildflowers doing extraordinary things along the hillsides. Lewis and Stella moved into the small house on the edge of town that Lewis had been renting since January and had spent the previous 2 months quietly making habitable, which involved, among other things, a significantly improved filing system for the marshal's paperwork that Stella had organized, and that Lewis had accepted with the particular gracious dignity of a man who knows when he has been improved. The house had a front porch that looked east, which meant they could drink coffee in the mornings watching the light come up, which they did regularly. It was not a romantic activity in any theatrical sense, just two people and their coffee in the morning, but Lewis had come to understand that this was exactly the kind of romance he had always been capable of and had simply never had the context for. Stella continued teaching. There had been a brief period during the winter when Mayor Boone had made some noise about whether a married woman should remain in the schoolteacher position, and Stella had had a conversation with him that Lewis had not been present for, but whose outcome was made clear by the fact that she was still teaching school, and Mayor Boone subsequently developed a habit of taking a very wide route around the marshal's wife when passing on the street. Lewis remained marshal. The work was quieter without Crane, but Cutter's Creek was still a frontier town on a busy road, and there was always something. He was good at the work and he knew it, and Stella's presence in his life had, unexpectedly, made him better at it, not because she softened him, but because having something of genuine value waiting for him at the end of the day gave him a different quality of patience, a willingness to find solutions that did not require escalation. In the summer of 1883, Stella told him she was expecting. She told him in the kitchen of their house on a Tuesday morning, before the day had gotten itself entirely organized, while he was making coffee and she was grading papers at the table. She had simply looked up from the papers and said, "Lewis, I think we are going to have a child." He had turned from the stove and she had watched him, and his face did the thing it did when he was feeling something large and was working out whether to let it show, and then he had crossed the kitchen and sat down across from her and taken her hands in his. "Are you certain?" he asked. "Fairly," she said. "I will see Dr. Marsh this week to confirm it." He looked at her. His hands, which could hold a rifle steady in a high wind, were not entirely steady around hers. "Good," he said, which was entirely insufficient and he knew it, but she seemed to understand all the things contained in the word, and she turned her hands to hold his back. "Good," she agreed. Dr. Marsh confirmed it in August. The baby was expected in early January 1884. The pregnancy changed some things and not others. Stella taught until December, when the physical requirements of late pregnancy made the daily walk and the long hours standing less practical. She was not happy about this, but accepted it with the grace of someone who understood the difference between wanting to continue and it being wise to continue. Lewis spent the last weeks of December in a state of controlled readiness that Mrs. Pratt, who came by regularly, described as like a man who has spotted trouble at the far end of the street but is pretending he has not. Stella had laughed at that. Their son was born on the 8th of January, 1884. He came into the world in the bedroom of their house on Creed Street with Dr. Marsh in attendance and Mrs. Pratt hovering outside the door, and he was loud and red and perfect, and Lewis Wells, who had been steady through firefights and confrontations and 8 months of a dangerous undercover operation, sat on the edge of the bed with his son in his arms for the first time and was not particularly steady at all. "He looks like you," Stella said, watching him from the pillows, tired and luminous. "He is better looking," Lewis said. "He is 20 minutes old," she said. "Give him time." "What do you want to call him?" Lewis asked. They had discussed names but not decided, because Stella had firm opinions and Lewis had mild ones, and the mild opinions had kept yielding to the firm ones, and then they had simply stopped landing on anything final. "James," she said. "James Lewis Wells." Lewis looked down at the small face of his son, at the dark eyes that were already scanning the world with an expression of profound and slightly offended concentration, and said, "James Lewis Wells." "Yes." He looked up at Stella and she was smiling, her real smile, the one she did not give out broadly, and he thought again what he had been thinking in varying forms for almost 2 years now, which was that he had not known it was possible to be this full of something, this specific kind of full that was not wanting more but simply being grateful for what was there. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For which part?" she asked. "All of it," he said. "The coffee on the porch, the filing system, the arguments." "All of it," She shook her head at him, which was her version of the same gesture he had long been making at her. "You are welcome," she said. "All of it." James Lewis Wells grew through 1884 with the uncomplicated enthusiasm of a healthy baby in a house full of warmth, and the town of Cutter's Creek grew along with him in its quieter way. The school enrollment increased as more families settled in the area, now that the threat of Crane's operations had been removed. A second general store opened. The livery expanded. A small doctor's surgery was built at ground level, so Dr. Marsh did not have to climb stairs to examine patients, which he had been wanting for 2 years. Lewis watched all of this from his position at the end of the main street and felt, with the measured satisfaction that was his version of pride, that this was what a town was supposed to look like. Not perfect, not without its disputes and difficulties, because frontier life generated both in reliable quantities, but functioning, moving forward, looking after itself. Deputy Rudd had been spoken to at considerable length about the September night he had left his post, and Stella had had to cover it. And he had not done anything of the kind since, and had in fact become notably more reliable, which Lewis attributed partly to the conversation, and partly to the fact that Rudd had gotten married himself in the spring, and apparently domestic responsibility had concentrated his professional focus. In the fall of 1884, Stella received a letter from Harlan County. Lewis watched her face when she read it and waited. She set it down on the kitchen table and looked out the window for a moment. "Gerald Ashworth is dead," she said. "His horse threw him in August. His family wrote to inform me." She was quiet for another moment. "I am not certain how I feel about that." "You do not have to feel any particular way about it," Lewis said. "He was not a good man," she said, "but he was a person." "Yes," Lewis said, "both things can be true." She nodded. There was a long pause, and then she said, "I am also glad it is over." "Is that terrible?" "No," Lewis said simply. "It is honest." She looked at him, and some of the tension that had been in her shoulders when she opened the letter went out of them. She picked up the letter and folded it and put it in the box where she kept documents that needed keeping, and that was the last time either of them spoke of Gerald Ashworth. The winter of 1884 into 1885 was a good winter, measured in the particular ways that mattered. James was walking with the confident unsteadiness of a 13-month-old, and had developed a serious devotion to the family dog, a brown hound of undistinguished heritage that Rudd had given them as a puppy, and who was called Sergeant. Sunday mornings on the porch had acquired a new dimension, which was James sitting between them in the wooden chair Lewis had built to be wide enough for the purpose, eating the corner of a biscuit, and watching the morning arrive with the same serious expression his father wore when looking at a wanted notice. Stella had begun writing a curriculum document, a formal teaching guide based on her years of experience, with the intention of sending it to a teacher's college in Austin that was beginning to develop frontier school programs. Lewis had read the draft and told her with complete sincerity that it was one of the more thoughtful documents he had encountered, and she had accepted this with the slightly surprised quality that still appeared occasionally when someone valued her work, which made him want to find and break several things, and also to tell her every day, which was more productive. On a Sunday in March of 1885, they were on the porch with their coffee in the early morning, James asleep inside for another half-hour at least, Sergeant doing his considered investigation of the yard. The light was coming up gold and long over the eastern hills, and there was a smell of cedar and new grass, and everything was very quiet except for the birds making their considerable noise in the cottonwoods along the creek. Stella was reading. Lewis was watching the light. "Lewis," she said, without looking up from her book. "Yes," he said. "Are you happy?" He turned and looked at her, at the woman who had stepped off a freight wagon with a carpetbag and a rifle, and proceeded to reorganize his professional filing system and his entire interior life, who had slept at his desk keeping watch when no one else would. who had told him the truth at every juncture when it would have been easier not to, who had agreed to marry him in January sunlight while discussing arithmetic, who had given him a son and a morning porch and a real laugh and the particular grace of being known. Yes, he said, absolutely. She looked up from her book at that. She studied him for a moment with the assessment that was still, after almost 3 years, one of his favorite things to be on the receiving end of. Good, she said. And then quietly, with the small, precise smile that was entirely hers, me too. She went back to her book. Lewis turned back to the morning light. The birds kept making their noise. Sergeant discovered something of great personal interest beneath the porch steps and pursued it with dedication. The coffee was still hot. Somewhere inside, James Lewis Wells stirred and made the small sound that preceded being awake, and in a moment he would be needing breakfast and Sergeant and his parents in that order of priority. But not yet. For this one still minute, in the March morning of 1885 in Cutter's Creek, Texas, everything was exactly where it needed to be. Lewis reached across the space between their chairs and his hand found hers without looking, and she turned her palm up and held it, and neither of them said anything at all, because there was nothing left to say that the morning was not already saying for them. The years stretched out ahead of them, ordinary and remarkable in the way of all real things, full of lessons and cases and seasons, and the particular daily negotiations of two people who had chosen each other with their eyes fully open. They would have another child, a daughter they named Clara Margaret, born in the summer of 1886, who arrived into the world with Stella's dark eyes and Lewis's absolute refusal to be rushed by anyone, and who was adored from her first hour by a 2-year-old James, who introduced her to Sergeant with a solemnity that made both parents smile. Lewis would serve as Marshal of Cutter's Creek for another 6 years, and when he finally handed the badge over to a younger man he had trained himself, Stella had marked the occasion by putting fresh coffee on the porch in the morning and saying, "What will you do with yourself?" "I imagine I will figure it out," he said. "I imagine I will have opinions about it," she said. "I am counting on that," he said, which was what he had said to her in January sunlight 2 years before she became his wife, and which was still completely true and would remain so. Cutter's Creek would grow. The school would grow. The curriculum document Stella had written would be adopted by 3 teachers' colleges by 1890, and the year it was formally published, she received a letter of recognition from the State Board of Education that made her put the letter down and look at the ceiling for a moment in a way that Lewis understood, because it was the look of a person who has spent a long time being told their work did not matter finding out definitively that it did. He had framed the letter and hung it in the kitchen where she would see it every morning, and she had looked at him when she found it with an expression so open and so full that he had crossed the room and held her, and she had let herself be held, which was still, always, the thing that meant the most, because Stella Grady had spent a long time not letting herself be held. And the fact that she would let Lewis was the specific private trust that he held more carefully than anything else he had ever been responsible for. James grew up to be a serious, curious boy who liked horses and mathematics with equal intensity, a combination his mother found deeply appropriate and his father found somewhat mysterious but entirely acceptable. He had his father's steadiness and his mother's precision, and neither of them could claim with a straight face that they were not profoundly biased in his favor. Clara grew up to have her mother's voice and her father's stubbornness, and an absolute talent for getting her own way that was distinct from either of her parents and entirely her own, and which Lewis had a quiet professional appreciation for even as he tried not to show it. On an evening in the autumn of 1889, Lewis and Stella sat on the porch of their house as the sun went down behind the hills, the house full of the sound of children inside, James at his studies and Clara doing something that involved a great deal of deliberate noise. Sergeant, old now and white-muzzled, lay at their feet with the contentment of a dog who had been loved comprehensively for 5 years. The town spread out before them, lit in the low evening gold, small and real and alive. Lewis looked at Stella. She was 40 years old and no less herself than she had been at 26, stepping off a wagon with a carpetbag and a rifle, only more so, the way things that are genuinely good become more themselves over time rather than less. "I keep thinking," she said, "about that night in the jailhouse, when you found me asleep at the desk." "Do you?" he said. "I was embarrassed," she said. "You were exhausted," he said. "Both," she said. "But the way you said it, 'Come on, I will take the watch from here.'" She paused. I had not had anyone say something like that to me in a very long time, not in a way that meant it. Lewis was quiet for a moment. The evening was going purple at the edges. "I meant it," he said. "I know," she said. "That was exactly it." He looked at her. She looked at him. Between them, 7 years of mornings and arguments and laughter and grief and growth and the absolute daily decision to choose each other over and over. "I still mean it," he said. "Whatever watch you are keeping, I am here." She reached over and took his hand, and he held it, and the evening came on around them, and the children were inside, and Sergeant slept, and the town of Cutter's Creek went about its business at the end of a day in 1889, and everything that needed to be said had been said, and everything that needed to be done had been done, and Stella Grady and Lewis Wells sat in the autumn evening with their lives whole around them, and it was more than enough. It was everything.